I'm delighted to have my welcome colleagues and my congratulations to Fumi, Dan and Rob for a terrific seminar lineup today. So thanks to our speakers in advance and thanks to you guys for participating. And in fact, this is the first, as you've heard, the first of a series of 5 really interesting workshops. And it's particularly exciting for myself and colleague Kevin Morgan, who I know is lurking somewhere, and also Jill Bristow, as we're the 3 co-conveners of a new interdisciplinary research centre, the Centre for Innovation Policy Research here in Cardiff. And this is our very first event. So thanks to Dan in particular for offering this event as a kick-off for the centre. And you're not here to listen to me, and I'm just going to give you just a flavour for who we are and what we're doing. And Dan can say a little more if you have questions during the course of the afternoon. I'm going to need to dip in and out, unfortunately. But I have just got one slide, if you can scroll to that, Dan or Ethan, that just gives you a flavour of who we are and what we're doing. So we're a group that has representation from the Business School, the School of Geography and Planning, and from the School of Social Sciences. And we're interested in a variety of different issues around innovation and innovation policy and a place-based approach to understanding innovation. We've got a number of different projects on the go at the moment, innovation and local well-being. And there are a couple of web links there for you to follow up on. And please do drop me a line if you're interested. I think this is a really interesting and an exciting initiative around using a challenge approach to try and engage public sector challenge holders with public, private and third sector problem solvers around societal challenges. And as I said, we're keen to engage on the policy front. And so Kevin, myself and another member of the centre, Dylan Henderson, are actively involved in a review of Welsh Government's innovation strategy. And it's involving us talking to between 40 and 50 people at the moment. And indeed, that's why I need to drop off the call shortly to go and have one of those conversations. And Kevin and I recently wrote a blog with some of our take on what the new innovation agenda in Wales might need to engage with and embrace. And that again is up on the website. There's the web link, and we'd be very interested to hear colleagues' thoughts on some of those ideas. I won't take any more time now, but as I say, happy to receive emails and inquiries about the centre, some of the work we're doing, and I certainly hope to be able to join you possibly again later on this afternoon, and certainly at one or more of the future events. But really pleased that this is our first CIPR event, and wish you well for this afternoon. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Fumi.
Zoom. And our first speaker is Andrew Johnston from Coventry University, and he's going to present on universities within the entrepreneurial ecosystem, exploring co-evolution. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Let me just share my slides. Okay, hopefully that's working okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Yeah, so I'm looking at universities within the entrepreneurial ecosystem and trying to understand issues to do with co-evolution within these systems. So this is an exploratory piece of work that I'm currently working on. It's probably about half finished. You'll be able to tell that it's not completely done yet. So the starting point is these are complex and dynamic systems really, but crucially they evolve as well. They change over time. But as Brown and Mason have described, multi-actor, multi-scalar phenomena. So I'm interested in looking at the role of the university within these ecosystems. What's the relationship of the university to the ecosystem, and what's the relationship of the ecosystem to the university, and how does this evolution arise? So trying to understand it through a focus on kind of structure agency and the creation of opportunities within the ecosystem, sort of drawing on the entrepreneurial literature there. So they aim really sort of contribute to debates and theorise in their ecosystems, and try to sort of introduce some new ideas and some new thinking. I've only got 15 minutes. I won't spend too long sort of I know it's the first presentation, but there's never expanded literature on entrepreneurial ecosystems. Some references there, but crucially, if you look at the sort of the definition of Ben Spiegel, that's universally adopted or adopted in quite a lot of work we see. Universities are mentioned as members of the ecosystem. But ecosystem literature just kind of brought context into the mainstream and this understanding of a kind of systemic approach to entrepreneurship. So that's the sort of start point for my thinking. So universities and entrepreneurial ecosystems, if you look at the work of Cardiff, the two distinct components of ecosystems around the knowledge ecosystem and the business ecosystem, a lot of authors are suggesting that the university is a key actor in this knowledge ecosystem, maybe even a keystone or an anchor there if we look at some of the work, but generally accepted that universities play a important part, mentioned, as I said, as members of the ecosystem. We've got the notion of entrepreneurial universities. The open innovation literature always identifies universities as key actors. Look at triple helix, or the augmented triple helix, the quadruple helix sort of innovation system is anchored by universities and sort of universities in the regional development process as well. So let's look sort of theorizing the university as an anchor of the ecosystem. So it's sort of the entrepreneurial process, the key to that is this notion of opportunity recognition. If we look at Shane and Venkatraman's work from sort of 20 years ago now, if we then draw on sort of the knowledge spillover entrepreneurship theory as Alton-Ack set out, so opportunities are based on sort of the knowledge in the system, what's being created and what's out there. So we can see the relationship between knowledge creation and opportunities and opportunity recognition. So we can then sort of conceptualize the ecosystem as a kind of formalized system of structures and agents and how these interact to create and support these opportunities. So we can say universities are important knowledge generators. Does this mean they're sort of opportunity generators? But if we sort of go down this route, then we're thinking that the properties of the university kind of determine the properties of the ecosystem. This all seems a little bit too deterministic, and the university is the ecosystem kind of thing. So these diagrams kind of outline this kind of simple view. We've got a university as a member of the ecosystem, and what the university does, the creation of the knowledge, etc., is moves around the other actors of the system. A more nuanced view around the three missions, sort of the teaching, research, and engagement activities of a university. So the outputs there into the ecosystem, sort of human capital, so skills, knowledge from research, enabling technology, some sort of business engagement and commercialization activities. So if we don't accept that the university sort of determines the ecosystem, how do we sort of theorize a kind of co-evolution or the dynamics of the two? So the literature is looking at kind of evolutionary approach to ecosystems. Some of the literature has been accused of being maybe a bit descriptive in nature, focus on maybe definitions, sort of boundaries and of what people do, etc. But as I said, this relationship isn't necessarily one way. That's the starting point of my thinking. So this kind of multi-actor phenomena, as I mentioned earlier. So capturing the kind of co-evolution and co-development of the ecosystem, and there's been increased interest in this over the last few years as well. Sort of look at evolution and dynamics of these ecosystems, looking at emergence of governance structures, how they've come about, the vibrancy and the trajectory, the sort of development trajectory, life cycles, and sort of overall evolution of how the ecosystem it does evolve over time. But if we look at trying to think about how we understand these evolutionary dynamics, how do we go about trying to sort of theorize a co-evolution of the the ecosystem in the university. So the approach that I'm taking and looking at this is this notion of morphogenesis around Margaret Archer's work. So we can think about the ecosystem as sort of inherently social and relational in construction. It's a social system. It's about interaction of actors. It's about this kind of systemic notion of entrepreneurship. So if we draw on Archer's work, so we can use morphogenesis to look at how these social systems can change. And she conceptualizes social systems as ever changing. And her work has been utilized, and this is where I got the inspiration from, in the entrepreneurship literature, looking at the kind of ideas of structure and agency and the construction and recognition of opportunity, and particularly from a critical realist perspective as well. But the main arguments of Archer's work really suggest that there's a dualism as opposed to duality. So structures will influence actions or agency, and actions or agency will alter the structures as a result of that change. So the way she analytically separates sort of structure and agency allows us to look at kind of evolution, allows us to understand a kind of temporal notion of a social system, and allows us to look at the ecosystem sort of through this lens. One of the other things she says, actions are ceaseless as well, so they're always happening. So it's always a churn of activities going on within the system. However, but once the actions have taken place, subsequent actions can then be different due to changes in the structures that they facilitate. She sort of conceptualizes this as sort of structural conditioning, followed by social interaction, followed by structural elaboration, which is the kind of outcomes of these activities. So to sum up my approach then, before I sort of take you through the conceptualization of this interdependence, is can we use this to sort of theorize how the sort of actions or agency of universities may influence the ecosystem, sort of the broad structures of the ecosystem, sort of generating opportunities and how they generate opportunities, to see then how the university's activities or its agency is then influenced in turn by the structures of the ecosystem and the opportunities that are enacted upon there. So hopefully it's not too complicated. It's I start to sometimes get lost in the kind of in the debates a bit, but this reflects my sort of recent, my most recent thinking and my way of conceptualizing this. So moving on from that deterministic view of the university does this, therefore the ecosystem does this, to trying to kind of build in a feedback loop. So we've still got the university with its sort of 3 missions: teaching, research, and engagement. I've still got the same kind of outcomes here in terms of human capital or skills, got knowledge, new knowledge. We've got sort of enabling technologies from commercialization activities. But if we think about how the university then has maybe created an enabling technology, things, for example, technologies like, or enabling technologies may influence things around AI or sort of Internet of Things, Industry 4.0. So maybe a platform such as Uber has emerged from these technologies. But then the fact this enabling technology has emerged and the opportunities it's created within the ecosystem then reflect back. So once you have these technologies created and the opportunities from them, this changes the market, because now maybe we have something like Uber, we want to understand how things go on, but then the market has changed and that then reflects back into the university. Now, once this enabling technology has created these opportunities as well, there's maybe pressures to change the curriculum to reflect on new skills needed for workers in these areas. There's maybe different levels of curiosity imposing on the university to understand where new research might want to go. So we've got this feedback loop. So we've got the university influences opportunities in the ecosystem through its outputs, but then the creation of these outputs and the opportunities that arise from them then reflect back onto the university through changing the ecosystem. We've got this kind of morphogenetic approach, this constant ceaseless action of changes and changes and changes. So in the interest of time, I mean, I've put policy and impact here as well, that, you know, just to reflect there are other things as well, but I'm trying to capture sort of the university in the ecosystem here. So the implication, so these actions are ceaseless and there's no sort of equilibrium within the ecosystem. What we've got is a continuing change, and we've got the university's actions changing the ecosystem, and then the change in the ecosystem changing the university's actions. So I tried to sum up this in terms of a kind of ideal type roles of the university. And I'll just sort of sum these up quickly as I begin to run out of time. So, you know, we've got a kind of role as a leader or an anchor institution, or a reactor or follower. So two ends of the spectrum, really. So universities are more focused on sort of leading and following. We see them, the actions, activities will sort of, you know, drive the ecosystem. Those that follow will respond to the ecosystem, and you know, they're the two kind of extremes. So I've got as far as a kind of 2x2 matrix here. So thinking about and thinking about kind of moving from conceptual to empirical, how we can maybe capture these things empirically in terms of responsiveness and determinism. So where you've got a university that's maybe not responsive to these changes, but also doesn't determine these changes, you've got a kind of peripheral university. Where it doesn't determine, but you've got it's highly responsive, you've got a university that's driven by its ecosystem, essentially, that is always reflecting back. On the other side, where you've got a university that's high in kind of determinism, you've got the ideal type, I guess, maybe, but I'm not attaching sort of labels to these. University drives the ecosystem in the long term, where it's both responsive and determinist in its activities. In the short term, the university will drive the ecosystem when it is deterministic, but it doesn't maybe respond, so it kind of moves out of that thing where it's not actually sort of in the driving seat of the university. So that kind of outline thinking so far. Final comments and critique your own work's not necessarily the best way to finish, but just to show you where I'm thinking, and maybe you know, sort of some questions that arise and implications of this work, what I'm thinking about. So I think, you know, we're trying to contribute to understanding or extending the understanding of ecosystems, particularly in the role of universities, and particularly in the role of each within each. However, we've got to realize universities are complex organizations. If you look at the work of Miller and Axe, you know, they could be an ecosystem unto themselves, couldn't they? How do we link to existing typologies of ecosystems? I've got the 2x2 matrix there, but the work of Spiegel and Harris from a couple of years ago, that's the sort of 4 types of ecosystem. Maybe need to think more about how these changes can link through to those. Is this too a general approach? Because, you know, the university, as I say again, is complex, and, you know, any from science to social science, maths, technology, all different things. Do we need to focus on maybe, you know, kind of life cycle model? If you look at the work of Kantner et al., who've drawn on Vernon's work from the 60s around, you know, focus on a single technology and related technologies around how these drivers go. That may be a way of thinking about it in more useful terms. The role of power as well. You know, the university is an anchor or gatekeeper. So does it act as a force for good, or is it a restriction on the ecosystem? So, you know, is it keeping people from the knowledge, or is it, you know, is it a good thing or a bad thing, essentially, in basic terms? And then back to this idea that the ecosystem is a kind of multi-actor, multi-scalar phenomenon. So we've got, you know, there's no one type of ecosystem, as we know. We can't just say, look at an ecosystem. How can we generalize this across different ecosystems in different countries? Probably come at it from a very kind of Western sort of capitalist way of thinking here. What about a kind of, you know, developing country context where, you know, the concepts that I've looked at here are maybe not quite as appropriate for analysis, but, you know, how generalizable can this model be? And it's about thinking again about empirics and trying to think about how these things can be looked at, moving from the conceptual to the empirical. But at the moment, I'm at the conceptual stage, and that sums up where I've got to with it. And I will welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your very interesting presentation. I invite all the questions from the floor. You can type the questions into the chat if you want to, or you can just raise your hand, and we will hopefully switch the microphone on.
I will stop sharing.
Shall we start with Katrina?
Yeah, I can start if you like. So thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I really like that you take this approach of questioning the deterministic role of the universities. But I was wondering if maybe you still put a lot of emphasis on the universities as an anchor firm. So maybe I think it's, so the universities, if they want to change the structures in their agencies, they still have to interact with other entrepreneurial actors and other actors of the ecosystem. And so I think maybe it makes, so you kind of attribute a lot of power to the universities, and maybe this power of universities might actually vary across entrepreneurial ecosystems.
That's a good point. I was sort of coming around to thinking that at the end there with the power, and the university is a force for good, or I mean in maybe Hollywood terms, force for good or force for evil. But you're right, it's too much emphasis on the university, and it's particularly from a policy point of view. What the danger is kind of saying the university is kind of isomorphic in nature, and and it also has to be kind of fetishized as the leader of the ecosystem, which you're right, that isn't what I'm trying to get across. So I think I'd probably just try to nuance that a bit better.
So I have a question from Ben as well.
Yeah, Andrew, really interesting stuff. And I agree with your issue with just this challenge of how to represent the different parts of the university. What I'd really recommend or suggest is really try to break down what universities do, because I think a lot of times it's at odds. The entrepreneurship, aspects of it are trying to encourage entrepreneurs, encourage commercialization, while the intellectual property agents are trying to tap it down and try to get the most revenue out of it. So what you might want to do is really try to create a typology of what actually universities do for an ecosystem, such as creating like the talent creation and attraction stuff, the knowledge production, the knowledge spillovers. And again, I think that'll allow you to really think about those peripheral sort of, putting your four-square matrix in these different areas, and then again, really be able to show how the agency is in what's actually going on and the differences between, say, getting people to come to a place and stay there versus, getting professors to spin out innovations.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful. Thanks, Ben.
We have Michael and Christina as well. Shall we give it to Michael, because he raised his hand earlier and then he kind of changed his mind, and then we'll go to Christina.
But thanks for the presentation. My question is, you describe universities as agents of change in an ecosystem, but we see many ecosystems that are persistent, so they do not change that much. Can universities also maybe a power of persistence and not just change? It's basically the same forces, as you say, like politics influence curricula, and then what comes out of the university influences the ecosystem, but that loop can also be meant to stabilize the thing we already see.
No, that's a useful way of putting it. I guess I was influenced by, when you look at sort of the literature on changes and stuff, it's always about something new coming out. And I think implicit in the ecosystem literature is this sort of, creation of new ventures or create something new coming out rather than persistence. But I think, that's a good way of looking at it in terms of maybe breaking down into, there could be a kind of recovery process as well, persistence, growth, bringing all these, resilience, bringing all these kind of ideas into it to really reflect, you're right, it's an ideal type of change for the good. But I think there's more to be understood in terms of what we're talking about in terms of change there. So that's a good point. Thank you.
And we have a question from Christina, and then maybe one question from the chat for me, right?
Thank you very much for the great presentation. And actually, I found that this is a very current and impactful topic. We need more about to understand the role of universities. And actually, what I see is that more and more universities trying to extend their mission and like how they impact and are more involved in the commercialization also for technologies, and they can fulfill the entrepreneurial ecosystem, the regional entrepreneurial ecosystem. And also, I have a question about, do you think that the university is the leader? You were saying previously the leadership, or is more about the legitimacy that has a legitimate role? Because from the when ecosystem started, we have like several points of view. It will be the incubator, it will be the university, will be the business angel that bring money in the ecosystem. So who has this legitimacy? And I was wondering, is it like a determinant of the ecosystem today? When we see successful entrepreneurial ecosystem, for example, Silicon Valley, you find very impactful universities that are more tend to the ecosystem, not close to the mission of educating but they have more an ecosystem mindset. And I think this is something that can be discussed.
I mean, I'll take the last point first. I think you're right. Thinking about Silicon Valley and the role of Stanford and in its development and sustaining the cluster as well. Yeah, I think that, you know, there's from the work, if you read Saxenian's work and other people, you know, the university looms large in the story, doesn't it? So I think, yes, where you've got a university that is firstly there and adapts and change. So this may be in terms of what I was saying about kind of reaction and determinism. It's got both, hasn't it? Because it's feeding in there. So I think, yeah, it's maybe that I don't know. This is what I was trying to get away from as well, saying there's an ideal type university of copying the Stanford Silicon Valley model, because, you know, maybe what you've got is a smaller city somewhere that has a university that still has a role to play at a more kind of general level. It may not be as spectacularly brilliant as Silicon Valley, but it could be, you know, a small city. I won't name any examples off the top of my head, but, you know, a small city in a small peripheral city with a university, it could be playing a huge role, but on an international stage doesn't show up. And then the legitimacy of the university, yes, I mean, I think with, you know, the university has, yeah, as a concept, you know, it's they're kind of accepted as, you know, bastions of knowledge, I guess, and sometimes it's almost a throwaway. If you look at, you know, Porter's work on clusters and definitions of ecosystems and industrial districts, there's always a university thrown in, you know, associated institutions or universities always sort of thrown into the mix, but never really more than that until someone comes along and sort of runs with it, you know, innovation systems as well. So, and you know, open innovation, so it comes from this kind of idea, you know, I guess they're kind of legitimized as they are as knowledge creating entities. Everyone knows what they do, you know, from the outside, and then they're included, and then there's a need to kind of understand and sort of drill down and think about, you know, maybe how legitimate they are. And going back to the first question around the emphasis on universities, you know, too much power, or, you know, if you read the industrial strategy from the UK that sort of put this emphasis on university knowledge, and, you know, we've picked these areas and the university knowledge in these areas is going to be commercialized, and the UK will be the leading economy, etc., etc. It's all very easy to do, but we have to take a step back and think more critically, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. It's great. So just because of the time, I'll just sort of throw in one question and sort of comment from the chat box. Felicia sort of, you know, sent a really nice sort of suggestion about interactions, evolution in the socioeconomic ecosystem. So I'll let you sort of, you know, think about it, just because of the time. One kind of a quick question, if you could sort of respond, given all this sort of conceptual discussion you shared with us today, what kind of methodology you're thinking as the next step? That's a question from Dina.
Okay. Well, the thing is, I mean, what we don't want to do is go along. I mean, for the UK audience who know about refs and TEFs and KEFs, etc., what we don't want to do is go along a kind of quantitative, broad brush approach of saying the university does this. So I think an approach that mixes, a survey in terms of, I think Mike Kitson did a big survey of UK academics about 10 years ago that's cropped up in quite a few publications in the last decade that was quite useful about university academics and their interactions. I think you've got to look at it more. I mean, I've obviously done it at the organizational level here, but I think empirically you need to get inside the university and understand it from academics' point of view. So maybe sort of quantitatively map in the extent to which academics interact with the ecosystem and how they react, but triangulating it obviously with qualitative case studies of particular departments or particular technologies and people and how it gets down to the individual level, who someone maybe is created an enabling technology, how they then work with someone to apply it in a business sense, and then how there's a feedback then maybe in that they then look at adapting their technology for all kinds of different activities. So I hope that's it's not a get out saying both quantitative and qualitative, but I think there is a need to look at it in a kind of triangular fashion.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrea, and thank you all. Yep, thank you all for the sort of questions and the interesting discussion from Aaron and Katlina in the chat box. So please do continue. But